Hi, this is Solar 50 from Elta Music, a 10-voice synth with 50 independently tunable analog oscillators. It's actually not as complicated as it looks, but it does represent a non-traditional and experimental approach to how synths should be programmed and played. Meaning by feel and by ear, rather than with black and white keys. In this video, we'll take a look at the pros and cons of this approach. More of this jam at the end of this video. Let's dive in. Before I start, the usual disclaimer: Elta Music sent this synth over for review. There was a cost to it, but much lower than retail. They have no say on the content of this video. This channel is funded by the good people on Patreon, the ad you just skipped, and an occasional affiliate link in the description. Let's start with an overview before diving into the details. Even though this synth has the most knobs and switches per inch that I've ever seen in a synth, Solar 50 is actually a relatively simple synth. The main thing that makes it so busy and causes it to look so complex is that it has 10 copies of the same exact analog voice structure. So this is voice 1, voice 2, voice 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. On most other polyphonic synths, the panel usually represents a single voice, and behind the scenes, a polyphony engine round robins through the different voices. You get a single set of controls, and all the voices behave exactly the same. If this synth was a traditional synth, basically this thing here would represent the entire voice structure just duplicated many times. We'll go over the voice structure in detail, but the idea here is that there are 5 oscillators per voice, and you can tune them any way you want. More practically, you probably need to tune them one by one, so you'd find some sort of orientation on an entirely continuous scale. Then this pad would play this note on this voice, and I could trigger another sound on this voice. And then you need to set the relationship between the two voices, or the interval between the notes. And then if I wanted, build chords around that. And if you're thinking it's out of tune, it's not, it's microtonal. And it was important for me to walk you through this process of building and layering chords in Solar 50, because that's the experience, for better or worse. This is how you use this instrument, as opposed to just playing with black and white keys. Aside from the 10 voices, you have a mixer with 10 knobs, 1 per voice, 2 global LFOs, an envelope follower, which is important as we'll see in a bit, a single analog global filter, meaning 1 global filter for the entire synth, not 1 per voice. So you could call this paraphonic if you wanted, but the voices still are independent, and a single mono effects engine that's programmable and accepts little cartridges to load up different algorithms to it. On the bottom are 10 main touch plates that are hardwired to each voice. So touch plate 2 is hardwired to voice 2, and touch plate 3 is hardwired to voice 3. Then you've got 2 additional gate touch plates that you can assign to anything, and a contact mic, a piezo contact mic that you can pass to the effects, as well as to the envelope follower for modulating anything that can be modulated across here. The build of Solar 50 feels very solid. It's thick metal and there's no wobble in the knobs at all. The oscillator switches are a little bit wobbly. For the most part, they work fine. When I got this, 3 of them didn't work. Actually, these 3 here, but I contacted Elta, and it turns out you can take these caps off and put WD-40 spray in here, and it has been working fine since then. Hopefully it stays that way. Solar 50 is a somewhat semi-modular synth, meaning that you can rewire some of how it works using patch cables. It comes with 5, and you can use additional ones if you want. You could also hook it up to Eurorack modules, which opens it up quite a bit. We'll explore a bit of that later on. Having so many knobs and switches does indeed make it feel a little bit cramped. I found that you can turn one knob without touching the other, except maybe in the case of these 2 knobs. So this is master pitch for the entire voice. It obviously impacts things very drastically, so you do have to be careful when you turn this knob, not to change the global pitch. I think it's best just to align it to the edge, so that if you do touch it accidentally, and we'll talk about what this does, you can always get things back to normal by turning it fully counterclockwise. From a connectivity perspective, aside from the modulation jacks on the panel, Solar 50 has a few audio inputs and outputs on the back, 2 audio inputs, one for external audio directly into the main mixer, and another mic or guitar input that goes into the preamp that's shared with the contact mic. Aside from that, there's no volt per octave or MIDI control over pitch or clock. So very much except for the digital effects and analog feel and experience. Now the I/O isn't exactly what you'd expect. Solar 50 actually, as far as the voices are concerned, a stereo synth. Voices 1 through 5 can go out the left output and voices 6 through 10 can go out the right output. This happens when you hook cables into the right and left outputs. And we can turn off the contact mic for now to make things less spooky. Anyway, once I do this, the oscillators are disconnected from the filter and the effects, and they each go out their separate outputs. Even if I turn the filter all the way down, you'll still hear the voices because they're going out their separate outputs. So if we take, for example, voice number 1, this is now sent only to the left output, not to the filter and not to the effects. Then voices 6 and on are sent out to your right and to the right output. And you can tune them to make a really lovely stereo chorus. And the output from here is louder, but for all intents and purposes, because we do want to use the filter and effects, I'll treat this as a mono synth, though you could of course use it in stereo if you want to connect external effects and filters to it. Before we dive further into the details, I want to address the issue of noise and some audio bleed. Not a noise generator because this doesn't have one, but just the overall noise floor of the synth. There is a noise that I would estimate at about 60 dB below a single unfiltered oscillator. So if we say look at a single oscillator and maybe give the effects a rest a bit, increase level, you can hear that better now. You can also see it on the scope. So I think that with one oscillator, maybe it's noticeable. It's mainly noticeable when there's nothing going on. Obviously, as you stack oscillators, the distance between the noise and the level of the oscillator increases. There's also a bit of bleed between the voices, especially if they're physically close to each other for some reason. So let's take this voice, for example. If I turn it completely off, you can sort of hear that. Again, I'll obviously show this to an extreme, bleeding in between. So again, you maybe barely hear it when the oscillator is on, but when it's off, you do. If you turn off the oscillators in that voice, then it's much less pronounced. So that was important for me to mention. It depends how sensitive you are to this noise and how you treat it in a mix. So with these preliminaries out of the way, let's dive into the voice structure. There are 5 oscillators per voice. Each oscillator works in a different range of the spectrum. And you can filter them, of course, but let's just listen to the raw ones. Each oscillator gets about 2.5 octaves range, and the range varies per voice. So between about 30 hertz to 80 or 90 or 100 hertz on the lower oscillator, then the second oscillator gets its range. Again, about 2.5 or octaves or more or less. These can be filtered, of course. They are all sawtooth waves. And the global pitch obviously impacts the range. And last one. Yeah, this might hurt your ears a bit, so let's not go all the way on that. Now the oscillators all transpose together, so if we put together, say, a reasonable chord, the master pitch knob for the voice works in the opposite direction, so turning it clockwise pitches all the oscillators downwards. And if you go past 12 o'clock, they start to cross-modulate each other. Now this is better heard when there's less going on, maybe. And especially with the higher frequency ones, I think. Let's maybe filter this a bit, though. So these are the 2 high oscillators. Let's start pitching them down, and You don't see a lot of cross mod because they have a nice harmonic relationship. If you change that a bit though, so let's maybe go for that starts to happen, which is different than just having one of them run. So, and then together, that's quite different. Now I'm not sure if this is just FM or ring mod. Sometimes it sounds like one, sometimes it sounds like the other. These sounds are still very sawtoothy in nature, but certainly they have richer harmonics and they sound different than each of the oscillators standalone. The trick to getting things that sound different or farther away from sawtooth, at least as possible, is to play around with a harmonic relationship between the different oscillators. And of course we have to try this with some reverb, right? So those are the oscillators, and like I mentioned, that's repeated 10 times. Let's talk a little bit about modulation. Each voice gets its own amp envelope, an attack, sustain, and release envelope. So attack is the time that it takes the voice to reach full level. Then release is the time it takes it to die down, and it's an ASR envelope, meaning that as long as you hold a note, it will play, and you can activate the ASR envelope and just hold a note by pressing this button. So this will activate the envelope, keep it sustained until it's released. Now we talked about the switches above the oscillators. That's what activates them or deactivates them. You may have also noticed 5 switches, one under each oscillator. These allow the pitch of the oscillator to be modulated. Now the pitch of the oscillator can be modulated by one of 2 sources, either a light sensor in this ominous round shape or control voltage sent in through this input. The benefit of sending control voltage into these is that it will also make the orb glow. We have the LFO in this case, modulating the pitch of this oscillator, and we can reduce the mod depth by turning this knob, but that reduces the glow, so what's the fun in that? I think at the very least we need one of these going in the background just to make it interesting. Anyway, when this isn't connected, like I mentioned, there's a light sensor here. So if I hold this and don't let any light in, you can hear the pitch bend somewhat. And for the sake of this demo, I borrowed my daughter's cell phone. If you use a lot of light on it, you'll get a more pronounced pitch bend. Now this light sensor, I think, actually isn't a toy. I think that as you play this synth, it gives even more life to the oscillators if you're willing to accept an occasional subtle pitch bend. But if you're playing in the sunlight and a cloud passes by, that may impact your pitch, so you'll want to turn this off. By the way, these switches, unlike the switches on top, don't get their own LED, and it is a little bit difficult to see whether they're impacting pitch or not, whether they're pressed in or not. So you do have to be mindful of these. To complete the description of the voices, they have 4 jacks. We already talked about the CV input for the pitch of the oscillators. There's a gate input over here, so you could say take one of these gate triggers and use that to trigger a voice instead of using the dedicated pads. And the advantage this has is that, say if you have a stack cable, which doesn't come with this and you might want to get, then you can trigger multiple voices this way at once, which is particularly useful if you're playing in stereo. Then you've got another input to manage the VCA if you want to do that externally, say with the envelope follower. And finally, there's an output to the ASR envelope, so you can modulate other things with this output. So say, for example, if you wanted 2 voices to move exactly the same way, you could use the release output to control the envelope of the other voice. A word about the jacks overall. If there's an arrow to the left going into a jack, that means that this is an input. And if there's an arrow pointing to the right, that means that these are all outputs. All right, moving on, you've got 2 LFOs. They're identical, and let's just patch them to hear them, say, into the filter. So there's a triangle wave shape, which goes into audio rates rather quickly, by the way, here. Not very high audio rates, but is nice and slow if you want it to be. And then that morphs, the LFO morphs into a square shape. which is great for rhythmic modulation. The contact mic, like we saw before, works here, but also, anywhere across the board. And with the effects can do some pretty interesting things. And then there's an envelope follower and gate detector. I'll show you a few things you can do with that in the patch ideas section, linked to here if you want to jump to that. To complete the tour, let's take a look at the filter and the effects. The filter is a 12 dB per octave Polyvox filter with resonance. It distorts nicely and will self-oscillate. Like I mentioned earlier, it can be voltage controlled with an attenuator. You can find a spot here where you can play it volt per octave, but that's really not the point here. I think there are plenty of oscillators to spare if you want additional notes. But yeah, if you want it, it will self-oscillate and generate a sine wave for you. So there is that if you want it. Let's take a quick listen to the effects. This is the Cathedral effects. You can plug and unplug effects cartridges. You just need to press this button when you plug in a new one, and then you can select one of 3 different algorithms. This is the Cathedral effect. Then you have 3 knobs to control the parameters of the effect. So in this case, this is shimmer. And you get this little cheat sheet with the parameters of each of the effects. So Cathedral, slot number 1, you've got octave up, octave down, and decay. So this is shimmer up. And this is shimmer down. And then you've got decay control. And yeah, the effects are very nice. This is based on the Spin FV1 chip. And if you want, there's like a $50 kit that you can use to program your own, and there are a lot of open source examples for this. We won't listen to all the effects, but yeah, and it has quite a few sweet spots. Let's swap out to Syntex. Syntex 1, which is a bass synth. Check out a few of its programs. Let's try Digital, which is a sample rate crusher. Time is an analog style classic delay. Elta call generator a noise mini synth. If I didn't mention this earlier, the 3 knobs I'm turning are all modulatable with control voltage. So any of the voice envelopes or the envelope follower can modulate these as destinations. Moving on, Magic is a set of pitched delay effects. Stringer Ringer is a set of audio rate modulation effects, like ring mod. Next up is Infinity, which starts out as its name suggests and does a few other things. Let's start with the obvious. But once you start tweaking its parameters, things like these start to happen. So those were the effects. Let's take a look at a few patch ideas. These pads aren't velocity sensitive, but you can hack your way around that if you use the contact mic. The envelope follower follows whatever goes into the either external input or the contact mic. So you can see it triggered here, and we don't need this, so we'll lower it. Now the envelope follower will either output an envelope based on the audio coming in and the attack and release settings over here, or it works as a gate detector. So we could patch this into pitch or anything else. Let's go for the filter cutoff. So now, the larger the mod depth, and the harder we hit the pad or touch plate, the more we get a filter modulation. This works not because the pads are velocity sensitive all of a sudden, but because the contact mic is picking up a louder thump. So that's pretty cool, and we could do that with the gate output as well if we wanted. I mentioned earlier Stackcables. These are useful here, like I showed you before, to say trigger multiple voices. The cool thing about Stackcables is that you can use them as dual splitters, so you could use one end to trigger one voice, and then another end, to trigger another one. So one stack cable buys you 15 oscillator unison. Moving on, Solar 50 doesn't have a sequencer, but you can sort of fake it in a couple of interesting ways. So let's say, for example, that I have this sequence. I could chain these voices to each other. Now release and attack times matter, of course, here for the speed of the sequence, but let's just go with this. Obviously, its rhythm greatly depends on the release times. Now, the problem with this sequence, other than its timing, is that it doesn't repeat. If we wanted, we could also use an LFO to trigger this cycle repeatedly. Or have it cascade across more voices. Hopefully you get the idea that there is some opportunity for creativity here, even though there's no built-in sequencer. Now this is one I've shown on numerous occasions. If you do want noise in this synth, like I said earlier, there is an internal noise, but it is at a low level compared to the oscillators. Then just radio noise in between the stations will do just fine. For, wind effects, or just adding grit to your sounds. To round out the patch ideas, let's take a look at a few Eurorack pairings. I've got the dot sequencer from DNI PRO. It's a Euclidean sequencer, and we can use that to trigger multiple voices. So this particular pattern has a bit of that bossa nova groove, but obviously you can use any trigger sequencer, just patch it up to the gates. So Solar 8 definitely isn't just for ambient drones. It can get rhythmic if you give it some help. Another area where Solar 50 can get by with a little help from friends is modulation. Its LFOs are pretty simple, but we could patch in any external complex modulator we wanted. In this case, I'll pass off control of the filter cutoff to Planar 2 from Intellijel. It has a built-in motion recorder, and we just need to set the mod depth to taste. If you don't have a CV motion recorder like this one, I made a whole video about creating custom LFOs as samples played back through a DC-coupled sampler. I'll link to that below. Anyhow, you record the custom motion on the motion recorder, and then just play it back into the filter and play along with it. Alright, before I head out to the pros and cons, I got asked how I compare this to Lyra 8. Now, as always, my answer is that if you really want to know everything I do, watch my review of Lyra 8 after this one. But if I had to summarize, obviously Solar 50 has 50 oscillators and Lyra 8 has 8, so it seems like more, but the two are still quite different. Solar 50 has relatively simple sawtooth timbres along with the cross mod, where Lyra 8 is more about crazy and wild timbres due to the sheer number of cross modulation going on there, much more than here. Solar 50 is more like a 50-piece brass orchestra you conduct with your fingers, where occasionally the players may get a little drunk and sensitive to light, whereas Lyra 8 is more like whales and aliens getting together for a party at a nuclear reactor, where if you try hard, you might get a word in. Again, that's if I had to summarize for the full comparison, check out that video, but bottom line is I wouldn't call Solar 50 a Lyra 8 killer. I think it's just a different thing. So that said, let's take a look at the pros and cons. On the cons side, it's pretty easy to find a ton of things that we've been accustomed to finding in regular synths that don't exist in Solar 50. The biggest one you should already be aware of is that you've got to tune each of its oscillators manually. And being analog, you might have to do this more than once in a session, certainly in between sessions. There's no proper volt per octave CV or MIDI control of the voices or oscillators in any way. The CV mod does let you have some CV control, but don't expect anything expected here. Of course, manual tuning is the whole point of this synth, but you do need to be mentally prepared for that. Yes, you can do it with a tuner, but I think the only way to get a fast workflow going that's also fun is just to do it by ear. On the hardware side, everything seems very solid except the switches, which, like I mentioned earlier, may need some WD-40, and the noise and oscillator bleed issue that I talked about in depth earlier. Other cons are that it only has one oscillator waveform, aside from the cross mods, and that shape happens to be a sawtooth, so don't expect harmonic subtlety unless you use the filter, and if you do, be prepared to lose the stereo field. These LEDs are very useful to help tell you which oscillators are on or not. It would have been nice if they had that for these switches. It's pretty hard to tell if these are active or not, especially if you're in the heat of moving things around. I also found the cross-mod implementation a bit more difficult to use than on standard synths, which on analog synths is hard to use anyway, because of the fact that you increase the cross-mod as you pitch the oscillators down. So you lose tuning by doing that. It makes it a bit harder to manage. I found that it's best just to find the cross mod depth, fine-tune your tone, keep it that way, and then have the other voices interact with that. Almost needless to say, there are no presets here, so my advice is to get a recorder ready when you start a session. And finally, the oscillators are indeed analog. Like I mentioned, they will drift and move around, so don't expect rock solid stability. So with all that said, what are the pros? It all comes down to what makes this synth interesting, and that is the sheer number of oscillators, not because there are a lot of them, but because of the way that you use them. So yes, you can play a big fat cross octave unison, but that's not the point, at least I don't think so. Rather, it's setting up chords and progressions and combinations that are built oscillator by oscillator, one at a time, layer by layer, and then moving through those progressions and exploring how they pair and stand by each other. That, to my knowledge, is something you just can't do on this scale on any other hardware synth, unless we're talking about the one with 1,000 oscillators built by Look Mum No Computer. The manual, by the way, is excellent. You can download it, but you also get it in hardware form. It's short and sweet and yet explains everything. And yeah, it's just very darn useful. Obviously, Solar 50 has additional pros or fun things to explore, the patch points, the contact mic, filter, and effects, all of which are nice additions, but in my opinion, it just boils down to the way you manage the oscillators. Again, not the fact that there are many of them, but rather the process you go through while building and layering them. And once you're done that process, if you want plenty more patch ideas for LFOs, envelope followers, slew limiters, and effects, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.